Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today's conversation sits at the intersection of World Autism Acceptance Week and Stress Awareness Month, two moments in the calendar that really invite us to think more deeply about how people experience the world differently. At HushAway, we spend a lot of time exploring emotional regulation and sensory environments and how sound can really influence how people feel. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Dr. Giulia Poerio, a psychologist and researcher with the University of Sussex. Giulia's work focuses on ASMR and how certain sensory experiences affect the nervous system. Giulia's also part of the Peace Path conversations that we have and really helps ensure that our work around sound and regulation is thoughtful and grounded in research. Giulia, it is wonderful to have you here. Hello.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Giulia, we've got a lot going on this month. So we've got Autism Acceptance Week. So let's talk about that a little bit first. So we often hear the phrase sensory differences. And for those people who are listening that maybe don't really understand what that is, from a psychological and research perspective, what does sensory processing actually mean?
Yeah, so sensory processing is kind of quite a broad term, but it essentially describes the way in which our kind of brain is detecting, organizing, filtering, and also interpreting all the information that is coming in from our senses. So we obviously have the kind of traditional sensory modalities like, sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. But we also get information from our body through a sense called interoception as well. So we're constantly kind of taking in all of this information from our senses and trying to decide what to do about it to kind of help regulate and guide our behavior. And a lot of this is kind of happening in the background. We won't necessarily be aware that this is what's happening. And actually, a lot of the time, what we're doing is we're filtering out sensory information that isn't actually very relevant to us or very important. So, obviously, most of us are probably wearing clothes right now, but we wouldn't necessarily be very consciously aware of the sensation of clothing on the skin because we're filtering that out because it's not very necessary. So a lot of the time we are kind of on a sensory autopilot and we're kind of not aware of these sensory stimulation. But oftentimes, and this is, common experience that people have, is that when sensory information is often unexpected or important, that can then help to guide behavior. So for example, if I notice that I'm too warm right now, I'm getting that signal, I might take my jumper off. Or if I suddenly hear that my doorbell's going, I'm like, oh, I need to go and answer the door, right? So sensory information is important for those sorts of things. But there are, of course, individual differences in the way that people process and respond to sensory information. And so often people talk about sensory sensitivity, which is about being more kind of reactive to sensory information. People with high sensory sensitivity will have kind of lower thresholds for sensory input to reach conscious processing. And that makes them much more reactive to things that many of us might just ordinarily filter out. So people with high sensory sensitivity might be able to notice kind of subtleties in the environment. For example, if you're very sensitive to sound, you might kind of notice other sounds that other people don't seem to hear. And so, this kind of noticing of these subtleties can be kind of quite distracting and sometimes overwhelming for people. And that's part of the reason for that is because, the brain is not able to filter out unnecessary sensory information. So these things kind of differ between people, but also within people. So some people are sensitive to some sensory things and not others.
It's so fascinating. And we hear a lot about sensory differences, which you've mentioned, and sound is often one of the most powerful elements in a child's environment. Many parents of autistic children talk about how certain sounds can feel really overwhelming for them, and while other sounds seem to bring an immediate sense of calm. So from a sensory research perspective, which is your area,
Yeah.
why can sound have such a strong impact on autistic individuals?
Yeah, I think sound is such an interesting modality in sensory terms because, although we might think of vision as being maybe one of our most primary senses, we can, if we want to, kind of block that out by kind of closing our eyes. But sound's a little bit different because, of course you can wear headphones, but there's no kind of innate mechanism that allows you to kind of switch sound off. And that's because sound is, really, really important. Even when we're sleeping, our eyes are shut, but our ears are still kind of open in a way. And so if you heard like a smoke alarm, you'd probably wake up, right? So sound does seem to have this really special connection to emotion and the way that sensory information is interpreted emotionally. And so lots of children with autism might find, sound particularly loud. Hyperacusis, which is a kind of a specific decreased tolerance to sound where, everyday sounds will seem much louder and they can often be described as quite painful even. And this is something it's often comorbid with autism. So there is this real connection between kind of sound and sensory overload from sound. And, there is kind of research that shows people with autism also perceive sounds to be louder, but they're also less able to habituate to sounds. So, for example, normally what would happen is that if you play a sound again and again and again, then your neural response or your physiological bodily response would kind of get less over time. But actually there's research that suggests that in ASD, repeated exposure of a sound rather than kind of decreasing your arousal response actually increases over time. So this is lack of ability to habituate. Essentially. And, of course, not all sounds are experienced in the same way. And as you say, there do appear to be sounds or certain sounds that actually might be helping to calm the nervous system down rather than create arousal. And there's probably lots of things kind of going on there. But I think, repetition and types of sound or familiarity with sound can actually help a lot. So it kind of helps to make the auditory processing much more predictable and also controllable. There's also a sense of, if you are somebody who's sensitive, if you are deliberately choosing to put sensory information in that is of a calming, repetitive nature, you're also kind of gaining more control over your sensory sensitivity and kind of harnessing that for good. And so a lot of people might talk about kind of these sort of repetitive types of sounds as a form of kind of auditory stimming, which is something that we know is helpful for kind of regulation in autism.
And that actually fits with what we do at HushAway, where it is about predictability and it is about the lovely rhythmic nature of the audio to create that sense of safety. But also one of the changes that we made with the products through the Sound Sonic ambassadors doing their testings was that we've given children a number of ways in which they can listen to one story. And for autistic children, it means that they get to choose how they want to listen, which is really, really important for them as well. So something I've been thinking about recently is, and you touched on this as well, about the environments that children sit in and how often we ask autistic children to adapt to those environments that are noisy, busy, overstimulating. But perhaps the more important question is whether we should be designing environments differently in the first place. So from a research perspective, how important is the sensory environment, including sound, in shaping how our autistic individuals or children experience places like schools or public places?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I totally agree. I think, this idea that people should be changing to fit in with the world rather than the world changing to fit in with the
Yeah.
diversity of people is really something that's important. And I do really feel like things are changing and, research understanding of sensory differences and sensory diversity and the fact that there are individual differences, I think can help support people to recognize that we should be catering for everybody. And that can be helpful when things are implemented at kind of more structural or environmental levels. But there are lots of things that, we can do to kind of help. And of course, from a research perspective, we know that things are multisensory. We're experiencing a multisensory world. So it's important to think about lots of different senses and how we might best accommodate them. I mean, lighting, for example, is a really big thing. People who are kind of visually sensitive or who experience migraine will often kind of notice flicker with lights, which can be kind of triggering. We also know that in, many classroom environments, they're actually too noisy or too echoey, and it's really hard to kind of for a lot of people to kind of understand what's being said and hearing speech. So it's really about trying to design spaces that kind of just that suit everybody, not just the average person. So I think if we can kind of cater to people with sensitivities, then we're actually just probably improving the environment for everybody. So nobody loses by us doing this and being more mindful and kind of deliberate about trying to create a sensory environment that is more inclusive.
That's so true. In a future conversation, we're going to talk about um, the the classroom environment and the school environment. And it was the WHO that did some research about the level of noise in classrooms. And I think the average was recorded at 75 decibels, whereas actually the right level for children to be able to learn is 35, something like that. So, which is huge, that's almost double. So one thing that many parents and teachers and educators talk about is this sensory overwhelm, which you've mentioned about
Yeah.
triggers, etc. So when someone experiences sensory overload, what is really happening in their nervous system?
Yeah. So, I mean, one way to kind of think about this is like having, loads of tabs open on your computer. There's lots of kind of processing demands on your computer, and the system is kind of getting overwhelmed. Your computer might, start running slower, it might shut down, and you need to kind of reboot it and restart it. As an analogy, that kind of relates to kind of this idea that there's this mismatch between what's going on in your external sensory world and the demands that it's kind of placing on you and the capacity of your nervous system to deal with that. And so what's happening when you've got this situation of overwhelm is that the autonomic nervous system is essentially basically treating this as a kind of a form of threat or instability, and as a result it's kind of activating the sympathetic nervous system. So this is kind of fight, flight, or freeze type response. And this is a physiological response that we can kind of measure as well. And there have been studies that look into the effects of these things on things like heart rate, temperature, sweating of your skin, so we can measure these things, but they're also kind of probably experienced emotionally as well. So people consciously experiencing this and also cognitively. So, when you are in this state of overwhelm, and you've got your sympathetic nervous system that's kicking into gear, it's also going to affect your cognitive processes. So it would be harder to kind of think clearly and flexibly, or your attention is more geared to kind of looking for threat rather than something else. So that can really have quite a broad effect on functioning, and it can look different in different people. In autism, it could link to a meltdown or shutdown, this kind of withdrawal and attempt to regulate. And I think what's kind of interesting is that prevention is probably better than cure, isn't it? So in an ideal world, what you'd want is a situation where that sensory overload, isn't happening. By trying to kind of get it to the point where your sympathetic nervous system isn't, really in gear, and also trying to find ways where you can activate the parasympathetic nervous system to get things into better balance.
I think what's interesting about sensory regulation is that the very, very small changes in the environment can sometimes have a huge impact. So why do subtle sensory cues like gentle sound and like predictable rhythm or quiet spaces, how do they help the nervous system settle?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to this idea of predictability again. Essentially, your brain doesn't really like to work hard. It wants to create things that are efficient. It wants to be able to predict what's coming next. So if you can do that in a sensory way, you can create environments that are predictable, then you're going to be able to help with regulation and reducing this kind of cognitive overload. So, I think this idea of trying to not let things build up so much that they can lead to overwhelm is another really kind of important thing. There's also some really interesting research on kind of neural entrainment, which is kind of an emerging area of research. But there's this idea that, if you've got a steady rhythm, like a metronome or a soundscape or music that you're listening to on repeat and things like that. There's this idea that you can get these kind of neural patterns which match to the sensory stimulus. So you're kind of entraining the brain into that pattern through sensory stimulation. And I don't think we really know how it works in research terms yet, but there is some evidence to suggest that this is what's occurring, and that it could be potentially beneficial by, again, kind of shifting the nervous system away from kind of the sympathetic flight or fight into more of a parasympathetic regulation, which is something that could kind of help create feelings of well-being and calm and recovery from sensory overwhelm as well. So it's a really interesting area research-wise of what's actually happening when you're giving the brain predictable sensory input in this deliberate way.
And we do consider that with our binaural beats and
Yeah.
layered behind the stories. So yes, the same.
Yeah, so binaural beats is one example of neural entrainment to sound. So you're getting the same kind of neural signal coming out in the way that you're inputting. So it's a training. Don't know how great the research is. There's loads more that needs to be done, but there is evidence to suggest that this might be what's happening and that it can be beneficial. So it's interesting research.
It's so interesting. And now on to my favourite subject, SMR, which you are a guru, and obviously you've done a lot of work and a lot of research around this. Many people describe ASMR as deeply calming. For those who may not be familiar with it, could you just explain in kind of your view what ASMR is and what your research has discovered about how it affects the body?
Yeah, so ASMR is a term that describes a particular kind of feeling that, as you say, it makes them feel very kind of calm and relaxed. And people often also describe a kind of a tingling sensation at the back of their head, which is characteristic of ASMR sensation. Yes, people do report this kind of calming response. What we've shown in some research is the effect that this is having on the autonomic nervous system. So we've looked at people's heart rates, their skin conductance levels, essentially what's going on in the body when they experience this kind of relaxing, tingling sensation. And we have some quite consistent evidence now across a number of studies showing that this is consistent with the relaxation response. So you get a lowering of heart rate. And the lowering of heart rate is similar to other kinds of interventions like things like mindfulness or music-based relaxation. So it does appear to be something that is beneficial in people that experience this. Even people who don't experience the tingling also tend to report feelings of relaxation and calm, which I think is also really interesting. The other thing that I think is quite key to ASMR, but maybe is slightly different from other forms of relaxation, is the social element. So we've also shown that, number one, voices tend to be something that trigger an ASMR response more than just kind of sounds like tapping. So there's something special about vocal ASMR or ASMR triggered by voices. And there is also something about kind of social connection. So we've shown that ASMR also increases feelings of social connection. And I think part of that is to do with the context in which ASMR is often experienced with somebody who's caring, creating a safe space for you. It's very nurturing. So there seems to be this kind of added social benefit as well for ASMR, which I think is a really interesting part of it.
So that's a really nice link. And so we're talking about calming, and it's a really nice bridge into another celebration this week, which is Stress Awareness Month. Every month should be a stress awareness month. We often talk about coping strategies, and we generally talk about this in relation to adults. But
Yeah.
from your perspective, what role can sensory experiences play in helping people manage stress, adults or children? Maybe we focus on adults first, because we do support a lot of co-regulation through HushAway. So when an adult's looking after themselves and their own stress receptors, then obviously children feed from that as well.
Yeah. I think it's such an interesting question, isn't it? This idea of coping or emotion regulation. And there's been lots of research on emotion regulation, lots of models of what the best emotion regulation strategies are and how to cope with certain things. And a lot of the time, and a lot of the research actually is really focused on what we would call kind of cognitive strategies. Reappraisal is a very common one that people talk about, particularly for adults, which is about trying to think about the situation quite differently. So a lot of kind of the research based on emotion regulation and coping has to do with kind of cognitive processes about thinking, really. But I actually think that a lot of the time that what's happening is that our sensory environment is affecting the way that we feel, probably mostly outside of conscious awareness, really. We may be not completely aware of how much impact these things are having on us. And, actually there's this really close relationship between sensing and emotional responses that can be a very helpful route for us to try and kind of very quickly regulate our emotional experiences. So if you think about something like, somebody giving you a hug, that is a very quick response. That tactile feedback produces effects quite quickly. Similarly, there's, a lot of research on different scents and how something like lavender can really very quickly produce relaxation responses, even outside of you consciously being aware that that's what's happening. So I think that there's probably a lot of things that people can do if they understand that the sensory environment is having this impact on their emotions. You might have like a candle in the background, or you might help listen to a certain piece of music or something, or certain types of noise to help you get to sleep. There are lots of different ways in which you can kind of curate your sensory environment to kind of make you feel better. You can also do what emotion regulation psychologists call situation selection, which is essentially avoiding situations where you know that you are going to get a response that is not good. So if you know that you are sensitive to, busy places, you select situations that do not put you in that position. So you can kind of think about that as a way of regulating too.
That's absolutely true. You mentioned um, fragrances and smells, and lavender always reminds me of my grandma. So it does,
Yeah.
it actually evokes this lovely sense of safety and security. It's quite funny how it's all linked.
Yeah. I mean, scent is really closely connected to memory. So there is also kind of people have a lot of kind of emotional connections to certain smells that are based on memory, like what you're describing. But again, scent is another really interesting sensory modality because it's gone very direct route to the brain. So yeah, we've done a bit of work looking at how different scents evoke different emotional responses as well, which is really interesting.
That is really interesting. And to your tummy, because whenever I smell toast, I just need to have a piece of toast. I
Yes,
love
yeah, I do think there is that.
bread, baked bread.
Yeah. And actually, you often hear scent and smell are really connected. So, a lot of times people talk about scents in terms of how things taste flavor wise. So, they might be like, it smells sweet, but sweet is a taste
Yeah.
thing rather than a smell thing. So,
Mm.
there's that close
Yeah.
connection.
So true. So true. And just on ASMR, I mean, much of the early research has really been conducted on adults. When you think about children, especially those who experience sensory sensitivity, what possibilities do you see for sound as a regulation tool for children and maybe perhaps neurodivergent children?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a good question, and I wish we had a better research base around the effects of ASMR in childhood. So there is quite a lot of anecdotal evidence, suggesting that ASMR can be helpful for kind of producing kind of calm for people who are, higher in sensory sensitivities. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence that this might be something that's helpful. And actually, one of the things I think is quite interesting about ASMR is that when you ask people about, their first experiences of ASMR, they'll often talk about things from their childhood, in the context of their parents talking to them very gently, or kind of playing with their hair, reading them stories, things like that. But now we can kind of experience those things as simulations through different forms of media. And that's really great because it makes this kind of content quite accessible to people if it's not something that they naturally come across in their everyday lives. But I think one of the things that's really important is that there needs to be real care in how these things are done, not only because it's children, but also when it comes to kind of sensory sensitive populations. Some of the things that we might consider to be ASMR stimuli could be experienced as extremely aversive. So it's not like all ASMR is going to work for everybody. It's really about trying to understand what are the things that will produce a kind of calming relaxation, and what are the things that maybe are to be avoided because they actually might produce an opposing reaction, which is, the really kind of stressful responses to sound. But I do think there seems to be something, very special about the voice and ASMR for kind of inducing this sensation. And so that does seem to be something that we kind of finding consistently, at least in adult research, that vocal characteristics and kind of gentle, soothing voices tend to be eliciting these effects. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was what was happening in children as well.
Thank you, Julia. Before we finish, because we are going to carry these conversations on at later stages with you, because ASMR is just so fascinating. I always think that it's quite new, and actually, it's been around for about 15 years, maybe.
Yeah, but also the term was coined in 2010. So yeah, for about 15 years. But of course, the sensation existed before the term was coined. So It's been around for a lot longer than that.
So before we finish, I'd love to leave people with a final thought from you for parents, teachers, and professionals who are supporting children with sensory sensitivities. What do you wish more people understood about how children experience the world?
Yeah. I think I wish that kind of everybody was able to kind of, experience other people's internal realities because, we're kind of supposedly all processing the same kind of external world. Like the same thing is going on around us, but what's happening subjectively in terms of people's own experiences can be really, really different. And I think what people tend to do is they tend to generalize from their own experience, which I think is a totally typical thing to do. I do this, of course, and we all do. We think, well, how I experience the world is also how other people experience the world. But I think that appreciating that, we do have different kind of experiences and how this sensory information affects our kind of our bodies and our brains in very different ways, not just kind of differences between me and you and other people, but also within ourselves. How I feel in the morning might be very different to how I feel at the end of the day. So I think trying to recognize that everybody has really individual reactions, I think is really important. And I also think it's kind of important to think about these things in terms of sensitivities, not as a problem or as a deficit. It's not a problem to be sensitive. And actually, there may be many advantages to being somebody who processes the world in a much deeper way. We could potentially kind of use that to enhance well-being as well. So, there are many advantages. Attention to detail is a great advantage from being highly able to kind of notice subtleties in the environment. But this is not by no means a bad thing to be sensitive, I think is a really important message.
I totally agree. Julia, thank you so much for this conversation. Understanding how sensory experiences influence stress and emotional regulation is such an important part of supporting both children and adults. And your research really helps bring clarity to a topic that many people experience but just don't fully understand. So we're incredibly grateful to have you as part of these Peace Path conversations that we're having, helping guide the work that we're doing through HushAway and the wider Peace Path community. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to explore more conversations like this, you can find them through the Peace Path and HushAway, where we continue to explore how small sensory experiences can really help us find peace in the little signs. You can learn more about us at hushaway.com. Thank you. Thank you, Julia.
Thanks, Nikki.